Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Why did the United Nations rise really out of the ashes of the devastation of World War II in 1945? How has the United Nations over the decades worked to eliminate the scourge of war, promote economic and social development, and enhance human rights? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're going to take a look at the United Nations and how it has evolved in many areas since 1945. My guest today is an expert on the United Nations and international issues. My guest today is former Ambassador William Vanden Heuvel. Ambassador Bill Vanden Heuvel served as the United States Deputy Ambassador to the United Nations from 1979 until 1981 during the Jimmy Carter administration. Currently, he is Chairman Emeritus of the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute and a current member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Ambassador Vanden Heuvel is the former chairman of the United Nations Association of the United States of America. Ambassador Bill Vanden Heuvel, welcome to Global Connections Television.
Glad to be back in the UN.
I appreciate you being back. When we started this about 9 years ago, you were one of the first guests. We're doing it again.
Thank you.
But let's focus a little bit on the United Nations. The UN was formed in 1945. How did it and how important was it that this organization came really out of the ashes of the devastation of World War II and to focus on bringing the countries of the world together to deal with these problems so they wouldn't deal with them on the battlefields the way we did in World War I and World War II?
Franklin Roosevelt is generally agreed to be the founder of the United Nations. He had had the experience of being in Woodrow Wilson's government. He'd seen the fate of the League of Nations over the years when it disrupted, fell apart, anger, turmoil. When the Second World War began, he began at the same time a process in the State Department to analyze what kind of international organization could emerge from the war that would enable us to have an instrument of international governance, not a government, but of governance that would help the nations of the world come together and solve their problems. World War II was the most devastating, brutal event in human history. 67 million people were killed. Countries, cities, homes, treasures were demolished, and the Holocaust was part of World War II. The leaders of the world were determined that that could not happen again. Roosevelt was a man of the future. Winston Churchill, a very great man, nevertheless was a person who was an imperialist by nature, and the British Empire was his concern. Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini were the face of the totalitarian forces going forward. Roosevelt was determined to have an organization based on representation of all nations, and at the same time have an instrument of power that could act and intervene in situations to prevent other wars. The Security Council is that instrument. The General Assembly is the instrument by which 193 nations come together. The United Nations is the only organization in the history of the world where every country of the world is a member and has stayed a member. Mm-hmm. And so I think it does so many different things. Refugees on the humanitarian side, health on the World Health Organization, development, the millennial goals. But people look to nuclear controls, but people look to it too to see what could be done to stop the violence and the mayhem of human existence.
Now, Franklin Roosevelt was known for many things, many activities that he undertook. But he was also known for his 4 freedoms. What were these 4 freedoms and how did they tie into the UN Charter that was adopted in 1945, June 26th in San Francisco, as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted December 10th, 1948?
On January 6, 1941, in his State of the Union address to Congress, Franklin Roosevelt talked about the terrible brutality and destruction and cost that would emerge from World War II. We were not yet in it. Pearl Harbor was 11 months away. But he knew we would be in it eventually. And so he said to the Congress and to the peoples of the world, nothing can justify this terrible thing we're going through unless we use it to create an instrument of governance that will help us live with one another at peace and promote social justice and control what was to come, which included nuclear weapons. And he said that the basis of that effort was built around the core of 4 principles: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Those phrases from the 4 freedoms are part of the UN Charter. They're part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that Eleanor Roosevelt had such a role in bringing about in 1948. And he said this is the challenge to every generation. He knew that every generation looked at the world differently and would emerge differently. But he said, in your time, you can do this. You can make major advances toward that. And it's the 4 freedoms still that remain there as a challenge to America, but he advocated it for peoples of every nation. He addressed it to the peoples of the world. And I think many people at the time thought of it as a new Magna Carta of human freedom and democracy. And even today, as they now are reminded of what the goal of America's leadership was to be, they know that the 4 freedoms is a major part of that.
Now, you've been involved in a very unique project called the 4 Freedoms Project. What is it? Why was it started? And where is it?
Well, the 4 Freedoms Park is right across from the UN. You're in the UN, you have to see the 4 Freedoms Park. It's on Roosevelt Island, an island named and dedicated to the memory of Franklin Roosevelt. It was started and dedicated in 1973 by Nelson Rockefeller and John Lindsay. Louis Kahn, one of the great architects of the 20th century, was chosen to be its architect. But then things intervened. Rockefeller became vice president of the United States. Louis Kahn died after completing the drawings. The city of New York went through practically bankruptcy. And so it was postponed and postponed. In 2004, I undertook to organize a group of citizens to build it. And we raised $54 million and built it. We've had 250,000 visitors come to the park already. I think the critics have said it's brought a new spiritual heart to New York. And that's the impression that I go over quite often. I see visitors. They're deeply moved by the experience. It doesn't take long if you're in New York to get over there. And I advise, we've had, as I say, 250,000 visitors already. So it's a wonderful thing to do.
And our viewers are encouraged to visit, and they can certainly Google this, and they can also go to your website, www. .org. Exactly. And let's focus.
And you'll have the best view of the United Nations that you'll have anywhere in the world.
That's exactly right.
You stand in the 4 Freedoms Park, and there is the majesty of the United Nations. And I like to think, because when I was ambassador here, you had to be in the UN buildings all the time, that the ambassadors are reminded every day, and those who serve the United Nations so well are reminded every day that this, in fact, was the challenge to create a world based upon the 4 freedoms.
Well, let's move out of 1945 and move to October 1962. At that time, you worked in the Kennedy administration, John F. Kennedy's administration, with Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General at that time. And we recall the horrific period we went through with the Cuban Missile Crisis. How close were we to actually pushing the button, the red button, and what role did the United Nations play? UTHANT, the diplomats here who negotiated behind the scenes to defuse this problem, because the next step would have been probably nuclear annihilation.
And evidence now reveals that the Soviets had already put weapons in Cuba that were in fact ready to go in terms of nuclear capacity. So had there been an invasion like Cuba, for example, it's altogether possible we would have had our first mutual encounter since World War II. But John Kennedy was determined to resolve it peacefully, and also determined to resolve it in such a way that it would prevent future occasions and confrontations of this kind. And Nikita Khrushchev, in their correspondence that was secret at the time, made it clear that all of us wanted to avoid a nuclear war. Adlai Stevenson was the spokesman for the United States. He was ambassador in the United Nations at that time. He gave a great speech. And of course, what the United Nations enabled us to do was to put the evidence on the table so that the world could see it. It wasn't the matter of the United States accusing Russia or the Soviet Union. It was a matter of the United States saying, here is this threat. They are moving offensive weapons 90 miles within the United States that have a nuclear capacity. We cannot allow it. And when people saw through the films that had been taken, the placement of those weaponry, et cetera, everybody knew that they had to do something. It could not be allowed to stand. Fortunately, it was resolved, and the United Nations played a very important role, providing the forum where the world could weigh in and discuss what had to be done.
Mm-hmm. Now, from 1977 until 79, you were ambassador with the United Nations in Geneva, and then 79 to 81, you were in New York. Excuse me. How was the atmosphere at that time? That was back during the heyday of the Cold War. There were areas where we were fighting the Cold War, like in the Security Council. The Soviet Union took their friends, went one way, the U.S. took their friends, went the other way, and kept vetoing one another's resolutions. But there was there not cooperation in many of the agencies of the United Nations back during that period?
You know, Geneva and New York are very different reflections of the United Nations. Geneva is a substantive place. It's where the specialized agencies work. It's where you have the Office of the High Commissioner of Refugees, of Human Rights, where you have the World Health Organization, where you have ILO. And therefore, you get a sense of really working on major problems and making progress. And New York is more the political center of the United Nations, where the nations of the world come together and fight out their political difference and ideological differences. But in those days, it was consumed by the Iranian hostage crisis. The American hostages had been kidnapped in November 1979, and for the rest of that term, number one agenda was how to get those hostages back because of the threat of war that they represented. I think the UN played a very important role in that time. The Secretary General went to Iran. I think the Iranians came here. There were many discussions with the Iranians and others here that played a constructive role. So just the fact that the UN, if it did nothing else than to enable the nations of the world to come together in a time of crisis and talk to one another, and I suggest that the centennial of World War I, which we are now remembering and celebrating, is a good time to remember why the United Nations is so crucial. Because World War I, which changed the world and devastated lives and nations, World War I came about almost accidentally in terms of the declarations of war that were involved. That can't happen now, I think, with the United Nations. The Security Council convenes, the crisis becomes the number one item on the agenda, the nation's leaders, the world's leaders come together, and so the UN plays a very constructive role.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Today, we're taking a look at the United Nations and its evolution since 1945. My guest today is an expert on the UN. My guest today is Ambassador Bill Vanden Heuvel. Ambassador Vanden Heuvel served as United States Deputy Ambassador to the UN 1979 to 1981. And currently, he is the Chairman Emeritus of the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute.
You know, Bill, there was an
instance
that recently that I thought showed the tremendous possibilities of the UN. I feel that the nations of the world don't use the UN anywhere near to the effectiveness that it could be. You know, people have to understand that the Association of Governments really isn't controlled at the UN. And the UN itself, as an organization, can't do anything really in the context of war and peace without the approval of the Security Council and the direction of the Security Council. But in the Syrian civil war that's going on, and which is just a humiliating episode in humankind, to think of 150,000 people being killed in a 2 or 3 year civil war, and that we've been unable to stop it. The point came where the Syrians were accused of using weapons of mass destruction, I think gas, poison gas. And there was a clamor for the President of the United States to intervene militarily and to bomb Syria in a devastating way, which I think he would have done had something else not happened. But something else did happen. The Russians, who are allies of Syria, proposed that Syria should sign the treaty against using weapons of mass destruction, and then agree to give up all of those weapons that it had in its storerooms. That was a proposal that the United States happily would accept, because that was the whole purpose of would have been the purpose of our bombing, was to destroy that. So if they voluntarily agreed to do it in the context of the United Nations, that was a major advance. And that happened. And I just wish that the UN had been given more credit for that situation. It couldn't have happened without the UN. It did happen. And we were very reluctant to go to war and use military operations again. So were the British. The Parliament voted against it. Our Congress would have voted against it. But in this way, the President was able to accomplish the purpose that served the world's needs, which is control of weapons of mass destruction.
And even though the Security Council could not agree on what should be done as far as in Syria, there's still, the UN system was there. You had the UN High Commission for Refugees, the UN Children's Fund, the UN World Health Organization. They were on the ground assisting millions of refugees and people who were in harm's way, and they were in harm's way. So the UN was actively involved, even though the Security Council was sort of paralyzed to some degree. We were talking about Syria. It brings to mind, too, about Iraq. We've seen the devastation that's taken place in Iraq really since March 2003, from the invasion of the so-called coalition of the willing going into that country. As you look at Iraq as a failed state, what role could the UN have played, even though the UN has been trying to help rebuild Iraq? The UN Children's Fund and all the groups like that have been in there. But what role could the UN play to help us prevent another situation like Iraq?
Iraq has been confronted by 2 presidents named George Bush. George Bush 41, who had been an ambassador at the United Nations, understood how this organization works and how it can implement and further the advances of democratic principles in the world. So when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the charter clearly said that that could not be allowed. George Bush organized the nations of the world, literally all of the nations of the world, Israel and Saudi Arabia on the same side, China and the United States on the same side, and collectively we confronted Saddam Hussein and restored Kuwait as an independent country. But the world did it together under American leadership and American military presence. It couldn't have happened otherwise. In 2003, the second George W. Bush chose to invade Iraq without UN approval and consent. A terrible mistake in my judgment. Everything that we wanted or said that we wanted out of Iraq, such as the weapons of mass destruction and their destruction, which we accused Saddam Hussein of having, could have been accomplished easily under the United Nations. Karl Blix, the great Swedish diplomat, was designated and accepted by Saddam Hussein as an inspector of weapons of mass destruction. He was authorized to go anywhere he wanted to in Iraq. And had we allowed him to do that, and had the UN been empowered to do that, we could have discovered that there were no weapons of mass destruction, as we subsequently discovered after a war that's cost 300,000 lives, 5,000 American sons and daughters in war, 50,000 American troops wounded, and a cost of well over $1 trillion. Now, the United Nations, in my judgment, could have prevented all of that if, in fact, our objective was the control of weapons of mass destruction. And today, as we see what's happening there again, it seems to me that the UN has to play a critical role, because the country now is falling apart. And a new social contract has to be agreed upon. Nations and people have to agree on how they're going to live with one another. That's not an overnight process. And the United Nations, I think, could fulfill that very helpfully, with the United States, Russia, Great Britain, the European Union, China, all of us working together to accomplish a common objective.
And of course, back in 2003, the majority of the nations at the UN did not believe Saddam had weapons. They were not in favor of the invasion. Majority of the people around the world were not in favor of it. In the United States, the polls were, but that switched about 2 years later, and the majority of the American public was not in favor of it. And as you mentioned, the loss and the devastation has just been absolutely incredible. And the money that could have been used on health projects or educational projects that really has been wasted, to be quite honest.
It's one of the most destructive episodes of leadership in American history, in my judgment.
It is widely viewed as the biggest foreign policy blunder ever in the United States, without a doubt. No doubt about it. Well, as you look down the road, though, Bill, what do you see as far as the United Nations in the future, the UN in the 21st century? The UN of today is not the UN of 1945. It is certainly considerably different.
With all the criticisms of the United Nations, the polls still show that well over 70% of Americans want the United Nations to succeed, want it to play a role of leadership in solving the world's problems. And I really regret that in American politics that we have not had a successor to Roosevelt or to Truman or to Eisenhower or to Kennedy, who in fact made the UN a very important part of American foreign policy objectives. And we could do it. The United Nations could be 10 times more effective if the United States truly were committed to its leadership. It's they're always fighting over the dues. The American dues in the United Nations are a pittance compared to our budget. I think $400 million a year is what we pay in the mandated dues. $400 million a year, that's the budget of the New York City Sanitation Department. And that's what our commitment is a mandated contribution to the United Nations. And when you think of what the United Nations does with voluntary contributions like the refugees, where would in Geneva in 1980, they announced the eradication of smallpox. Smallpox, which had been the scourge of mankind, its plagues had killed literally millions of people. Because the World Health Organization was able to bring all of the nations of the world together, we were able to eradicate smallpox. We're trying to do that today, and we will do it with polio. President Roosevelt was a victim of polio. He was disabled, couldn't walk, couldn't stand alone, but he became president of the United States. But I mean, his commitment to the scourge of polio resulted in the Salk vaccine and the Sabin vaccines. Today with that, we're almost there. There's only 3 nations in the world, I think, left where polio is still extant. If we concentrated on things like that, we could make this a much better world. And in economic development, every area, frankly, in human rights, the UN has played a very constructive role. And we should be proud of that, because a large part of it has happened because of United States support. And we as citizens of the United States should take pride that our President Franklin Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt played such important roles in the founding of the UN and setting it in the direction it is.
Exactly. And as you mentioned about Polio Plus program, that is the largest international health project ever undertaken with the UN World Health Organization, UN Children's Fund, Rotary International, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and many other players. And there are, as you mentioned, only 3 countries left, and it will be eradicated at some point. But that just shows what can be done when they cooperate and coordinate and work together on these problems. But these are extremely important projects, Bill. They're important programs, and we will have to hold the remainder of the questions on how to improve the United Nations, make it more effective, more efficient for the next show. But Ambassador Bill Vanden Heuvel, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.